Good morning, CIMVHR virtual forum participants. I'm Dr. David Pedler, Scientific Director of the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research. Welcome to day 3 of our oral presentations that will begin with a keynote presentation by Dr. Jennifer Lee, followed by Serving Military Session C and Family Session A. We have a fantastic lineup. Before we begin, let's acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we're meeting virtually, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Before I introduce our next speaker, I will invite Dr. CIMVHR to say a few words.
Merci David. C'est un grand plaisir de présenter en tant que vice-rectrice à la recherche le Collège militaire royal du Canada, qui est l'une des institutions fondatrices de l'Institut canadien de recherche sur la santé des militaires et des vétérans. Nous connaissons les particularités liées à l'expérience militaire, autant pour les membres en service, les vétérans, ainsi que pour les proches. Nous explorons aussi les besoins spécifiques des professionnels similaires, tels que les premiers répondants et bien d'autres. Les présentations de haut calibre qui vont vous être présentées montreront à quel point la recherche émergente prend en compte les besoins différents des femmes et des hommes et comment la recherche détermine souvent les politiques. Ces avenues et bien d'autres vous seront présentées ici au forum au cours du prochain mois. Nous vous y attendons en grand nombre. Bon forum!
I would now like to invite CIMVHR Research Advisor on Military and Veteran Families and Associate Professor in the School of Rehabilitation Therapy at Queen's University, Dr. Heidi Cram, to open the family session. Heidi?
Thanks, Dave, and welcome to the family stream at CIMVHR's 2021 Virtual Forum Series. For those of you who know me, you know how excited I get about coming together and discussing research to better understand and respond to the needs and experiences of families of military, veteran, and public safety personnel. At these moments, I take stock of how far the field has come. Families matter to those who serve and who have served, as well as their organizations. Families have needs and experiences in relation to service in their own right. And today we will continue to elevate the discourse with one another about research that showcases the diversity of perspectives, methods, issues, and voices we are able to capture. Thank you for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next year in person for Forum 2022.
It is now my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Jennifer Lee, who will be presenting on the findings from the COVID-19 Defense Team Survey in the presentation, The Many Faces of Family in the Time of COVID-19. Dr. Lee is a defense scientist at the Department of National Defense. She is Acting Director of Research on Personnel and Family Support and oversees her team's work on a range of topics, including sexual misconduct, diversity and inclusion, personnel and family support programs, and various topics in military, veteran, and family health. Her own research centers on resilience and psychosocial aspects of health among service members and their families, particularly during career transition. Dr. Lee, thank you for being here.
All right, good morning. I'm Jennifer Lee. I am the Director of Research on Personnel and Family Support at National Defense in Ottawa. I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which I work and from which I am speaking today is the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people. I'm incredibly honored to be presenting this keynote today on the many faces of family in the time of COVID-19. So first, I'd like to disclose that I have no relationship with commercial interests. I receive no commercial support for this work, and therefore I have no potential bias to mitigate. So before I get into the talk, I'll give you a bit of an idea of what we'll be covering. First, I'll talk about what we mean by family. Then I'll move into some of the research that we've been doing to look at the impacts of the pandemic on military families. And then in the discussion, I'm going to summarize some of the key insights that comes from this work and use them to emphasize some of the potential directions that we can take in future research to examine issues surrounding diversity and how it applies and how we both define family and how we both understand questions related to family. So I'll begin with the important question of what is family? Now, while you think that it's pretty straightforward to answer that question, what family actually means is still debated in academic research and society. And what's clear is that how we define family is incredibly important because it can shape social policy that determines who can receive certain rights, entitlements, or benefits. So in an interesting paper from the early 90s, the distinction was made between definitions of family that were based more on religion or law versus those that were based on things like how individuals relate to one another or the various functions that families play in one's life. These other so-called functional definitions of family, they tend to be more inclusive and they enable a wider range of individuals and types of relationships to be recognized as part of family structures. And a really good example of a functional definition is that of the Veuillez Institute, which explicitly states its intent of being broad in order to ensure greater inclusion in its definition. And I've got it listed here on the slide, but I won't read it. So aside from the way that family is defined in the academic literature, there's also the way that people themselves define family that's interesting to look at. In an interesting study that was conducted in the early 2000s in the US, Brian Powell and his colleagues interviewed a large number of Americans on their views regarding family at 3 time points between 2003 and 2010. And what they actually wanted to know was, they asked individuals to identify the types of living arrangements that they counted as families. And using data on this question that was collected in the earlier years of their study, they were able to identify 3 typologies for how people define families. The exclusionists were those that tended to focus on structure, law, and religion and how they viewed family. By contrast, the inclusionists tended to view almost all of the living arrangements as family. And they also tended to focus more on things like affective ties in the way that they define family. So using these 3 typologies, Powell was able to show that while half of the participants in 2003 were either inclusionists or moderates, this increased to 2/3 in 2010. And all of this happened while the legalization of same-sex marriage was becoming more widespread across the US. So while it's the evolving notions of family that are what might have contributed to changing laws regarding same-sex marriage, these changed laws around it also might have helped shape how people conceptualize family. So what this tells us is that individuals' notions of what constitute family also evolve over time. And in some cases, they can be surprisingly rapid. So regarding how family structures themselves have evolved in Canada over time, we've been able to learn a lot from analyses of the census data. So in this work, the family is typically defined as individuals who are married or in a common law relationship with or without children, or lone parents having any marital status with at least 1 child. And despite using a bit more of a restrictive definition of family that's based on demographic information that's collected during the census, as opposed to more functional definitions, the census has provided a lot of valuable insights that point to the increasing diversity of families in the Canadian society. So in an analysis of over 50 years of census data that was conducted in 2011, it was found that there was a decreasing proportion of married couples among census families, but at the same time, there was a growing proportion of single-parent families. And interestingly, it was also found that the proportion of individuals who were living outside of a census family had increased over this time. So in 1961, there was about 9% of the total population living in private households that didn't live in a census family. But by 2011, this increased to 17%. So another important variable that can be interesting to consider when examining family trends is household size. And regarding households, one of the most interesting things that we've seen is that these have gotten steadily smaller in Canada over the past 60 years. By the time 2016 rolled around, 1-person households were, for the first time in Canadian history, the most common household type and represented 28% of all households. So along with trends based on census family, these trends raise some interesting questions about whether our current definitions of family are sufficient, or whether there are certain structures or dynamics that might have emerged that are not being captured in these definitions that we need to further explore. So I've shown how families change in Canadian society, but have we been seeing the same kind of changes in the military population? Well, we might think of military families as primarily consisting of the nuclear family, so 2 parents, 2 kids, but there's also evidence showing similar trends among CAF members. So if we look at marital status alone, we see that this trend is similar to what we found in the Canadian population, with the proportion of married CAF members having decreased and the proportion of never married single CAF members having increased over the past couple of decades. And this is for the regular force. As of March 31st, 2021, there was roughly an equal percentage of regular force members that were single compared to those who were married. So why do we want to know about family-related characteristics of CAF members? Well, that question is pretty easy to answer because we know from about a decade and a half of research on military families that families are very much impacted by military lifestyle, but also families can greatly impact how service members experience challenges throughout their military career. So in a recent scoping review of Canadian military research that was conducted by Linda Manser, there are 3 aspects of military lifestyle that really stood out as common challenges for military families based on this body of work. And that included the physical separation, the risk of operational illness, injury, or death, and relocation. But it's not just military families that are impacted by the lifestyle, but also that service members' family lives can very much influence their well-being. So as one example, an analysis of the Canadian Forces mental health survey found that living as a single parent was associated with greater odds of reporting past year anxiety or mood disorder compared to living alone without any dependent children. So we might think of those who are living alone as being a bit more at risk because they don't necessarily have the same support network. This is even more the case if we have the added responsibility of children. So we've now covered how military life can impact families and how family concerns can impact military life. How do we make the jump to COVID-19? From the very beginning, it was clear that the pandemic was having a marked impact on the workplace. And for CAF members, the activation of op laser, so the CAF's response to COVID-19, that meant that some members would also carry that extra role of being involved in these efforts. And this possibly could compound some of the impacts. So now we know a little bit more about the nature and the extent of the CAF's response to the pandemic, but it's important to remember that at the time, early days, the full extent of our involvement was really uncertain. But what we did know was that the impacts were substantial on the workforce and that there was a lot of desire among leadership to understand the specific nature of these impacts to better support defense team personnel. So despite the challenges that were inherent to having to abruptly adapt to remote working, a team of D&D researchers was stood up to develop the COVID-19 Defense Team Survey specifically to serve this purpose. So how do you go about developing a survey on a phenomenon that is absolutely unprecedented and that the majority of your target population has never experienced in their lifetime? So to do this, we turned to research that had been conducted in relation to the SARS 2003 outbreak in Toronto. Now, at the time, there was considerable uncertainty about how big of a situation SARS would be. But we now know, fortunately, that that particular variant of SARS turned out to be the kind of virus that fizzled out and remained fairly contained. But among those who were impacted by this situation, the effects weren't minor. And in particular, the healthcare workers were heavily impacted. And when all of the research is considered to draw up some of the list of lessons learned from all the work conducted in relation to SARS, being a parent was among one of the top factors that was associated with the risk of stress among healthcare workers. A lot of healthcare workers, they noted the difficulty of having to return home after work, especially to their families. This was especially the case when there were children present at home. Hospital workers worried about passing on infection. They also worried about the stigma that their family members might experience because of the fact that they were healthcare workers. And they also worried that if they were quarantined, they wondered what would happen to their children in terms of childcare. This was particularly an issue for those who were single parents. So what we learned from SARS in 2003 was that the impact on families was remarkable and that the infrastructure around dealing with this kind of scenario was lacking, including in terms of childcare. So from that perspective, we felt that our survey on the impacts of COVID-19 on the defense team should have a very strong focus on the impact on participants' families. So to give you a bit more information about the COVID-19 Defense Team Survey, it was conducted between April and May of 2020 and was completed by over 27,000 defense team members. It had over 70 questions that looked at a lot of different issues, including potential concerns that individuals might have in relation to COVID-19. In addition to looking at the lessons learned from the 2003 SARS outbreak, we also leveraged a lot of the work that was happening in our networks to rapidly develop our survey. So this included our partners through the Technical Cooperation Program, in particular, one of the groups devoted to behavioral health leadership aspects of resilience, which is led by Dr. Amy Adler in the US. So in the end, the survey was designed to explore a lot of different issues that could potentially impact defense team members. But what I'll mostly focus on today are the aspects of the survey that covered well-being, so health, work, and family, as well as how these are associated with mental health and well-being. But it's important to note that that's only one part of what the survey actually covered. So when we first think about the impacts of the pandemic on the workforce, the thing that really comes to mind, at least from the perspective of federal government workers, is how challenging it was to have to rapidly adjust to working from home. In March 2020, an estimated 2.8 million people in Canada were already having to work away from their workplace due to the pandemic. And those who were still working, a lot of them had to work from home. So according to our survey, many of our CAF members were also having to adjust working from home, with roughly half of them reporting that they were doing that. However, there's also a quarter of them that were still working at their usual workplace, suggesting that they were essential staff. And from a family perspective, either of these scenarios, whether or not they require adjustment to a new workplace, are things that can be disruptive. No matter how you slice this, changes to the work posture and just the mere impacts of the pandemic already had a very real possibility of impacting families. So in fact, when we actually did take a look at some of the top concerns that were related to the pandemic by members of the that were reported by members of the defense team, we actually found that the ones that were at the top centered on health and the well-being of their loved ones. And similarly, the social or family impacts were also quite prominent in the surveys conducted by our TTCP partners, or the Technical Cooperation Program. In New Zealand, for instance, half of the service members who reported working remotely indicated that experiencing conflict with family demands was an important work challenge. And in the US, it was found that the majority of US Army soldiers who were married or in a relationship indicated that they or their spouse had difficulty coping with the impacts of the pandemic. And also half of those who had children reported that they were experiencing emotional, behavioral, or other difficulties. And the more that they reported these kind of difficulties, the more likely they were to screen positive for anxiety and depression. So we can see that Canada is not alone in terms of the magnitude of the impacts on the pandemic on service members' families. So given the concerns related to family in our survey, it helps to understand the characteristics regarding family. So in this table, we see the proportion of regular force and primary reserve members that are living in different household sizes at the time of the survey. And we also see the proportion that are living in various types of family compositions. So to create our categories for family compositions, we considered participants' marital status, as well as whether they reported living with children that were under the age of 18, either part-time or full-time at the time of the survey. And by cross-tabulating these two variables, we were able to generate 4 categories of family composition that are shown in the table. And what we see is that the majority of CAF members overall were living in households that were consisting of at least another individual. There was more differences in terms of regular force and primary reserve members when it comes to family composition. But if we focus just on the regular force members, we see about a third of them were single with no dependent children, while just a little over a third were married or in a common law relationship with dependent children. So we know from the overall findings of the survey that family concerns were prominent throughout. But we thought it'd also be interesting to look at whether there was any variation in the top concerns according to family composition. And in the next slide, just in the interest of time, I'm going to focus more on regular force to explore this question. So what we found when we actually broke down the top 5 concerns by family composition is that there was in fact some interesting differences between the groups. The percentages reported here represent the total percentage of participants within each family composition category who reported being either very or extremely concerned about the items that are listed. So if we zoom in on the percentages that are associated with the top 5 items among those who are married or in a common law relationship with dependent children, we see that the percentages are higher compared to those who are single with no dependent children. So it does show that the concerns in this population related to family tend to be higher. But what's interesting is that across all of the groups, family concerns, or at least some that are interpersonal in nature, were prominent. So even among those who are single with no dependent children, there's still a high degree of concern over a loved one contracting COVID-19 and maintaining social ties with others. So given that some of the percentages related to concerns were higher in some of the family composition groups, another question we might want to ask is, to what extent is this reflected in mental health? So one of the questions we included in our survey was whether participants felt that their mental health changed since the start of the pandemic. And here we see the percentage of regular force members who reported that their mental health had gotten worse in the dark red, broken down by their family composition. So interestingly, there's actually not too many differences between the groups. And this can be partly of the fact that the mental health item that we looked at here was defined very broadly. But if we start looking into possibly more specific details of well-being, maybe we might see some differences. So 2 specific aspects of well-being that we felt might be especially relevant in the context of the pandemic was loneliness, because of the physical distancing measures that put in place, which prevented people from spending time with each other, and also feeling emotionally drained just from the sheer nature of the emotional impacts of the pandemic on everyone. And in fact, when we looked at mental health or well-being in terms of these more specific aspects, we do start to see some interesting findings across the group. So for loneliness, we can see that those who are single were generally more likely to feel lonely more than half the time compared to those who are married or in a common law relationship. And this was especially the case if they were single without any dependent children. And in terms of feeling emotionally drained, it was those who were living with dependent children that tended to be reporting this more than half the days, as opposed to those who didn't have children. So while we might not have seen that many differences between the groups in terms of reporting worse mental health, we might also ask whether the concerns that they experienced were associated with mental health decrements in different ways. So to check this out, we conducted 4 separate analyses, one for each of the family composition categories. And each of the analyses were adjusted for gender, as well as each of the family-related concerns that emerged as the top concerns across the board. So what this table is actually showing us is that when we factor in all of the possible family-related concerns together, the ones with the X are those that remain significantly associated with worse mental health. So this gives us a rough and dirty idea of what was most strongly associated with mental health, all things considered. So looking at the results, first off, we see that no matter what the family composition, some but not necessarily all of the family-related concerns were associated with worse mental health. And the other thing that stands out is that some of the concerns that were associated with mental health were not necessarily those that were among the top 5 that were identified in a particular family composition group. And the case that really stands out here is the fact that balancing work and childcare was significantly associated with worse mental health among those who are single with no dependent children, even though this isn't an issue that emerged at all as part of a top concern in this group. So this is a bit of a weird thing, but I think what this does emphasize is that there's some heterogeneity that exists even within family composition groups. And it also might point to some of the problems that exist in how we define family composition if we rely solely on demographic information, because it shows that we can't really rely on that information alone to make any assumptions. So in this case, single members may not have had any dependent children of their own, but that doesn't preclude them from facing similar issues, especially if they were caring for other dependent children of other people. or even if they express this concern in relation to the fact that some of their own loved ones were struggling with this issue. So I've presented you with a fairly simple way of slicing and dicing some of the results of the COVID-19 Defense Team survey to get some insights into how the pandemic has impacted diverse types of families and how it presented some challenges for CAF members and their families, regardless of family composition. And while the findings I've presented only scratch the surface in terms of what we can do with the survey, they show how service members' family-related concerns aren't always perfectly matched with their family composition. The concerns that regular force members had that were related to family were multidimensional, they were complex. Both their nature and their impacts varied by family composition, and they were not always doing that in a way that we'd expect. So we found that almost as many family-related concerns were associated with worse mental health among regular force members who were single with no dependent children than among those that who were married or in a common law relationship with dependent children. So even if these groups experienced concerns at varying levels, experiencing these concerns was associated with worse mental health in a similar manner or a similar extent. And if we take all these findings regarding changes and we combine them with those regarding changes in family structure in Canada over time, it shows us that we have to start thinking about adopting more diverse perspectives of family to really understand how individuals' work circumstances can impact their family lives. We also have to look beyond using demographic information to define family and pay attention to the experiences of those individuals who may not necessarily always fall in a given family category as we currently define it, because this can point to some important gaps in terms of how we conceptualize family. In addition, it would also be useful for future research to focus on better understanding diversity and gender-based analysis plus aspects of how family experiences can vary, even within certain family structures. There may be a great deal of heterogeneity in how individuals of varying genders, ethnicities, or cultures make sense of their experiences, even if they're part of a similar family composition. And getting a better understanding of these aspects is really important if we want to develop more inclusive policies and programs that better serve all CAF families. So the results I've covered from our survey have only been limited to examining family issues using a bit more of a restrictive definition based on demographic information. And while defining family in this way can be practical for conducting research on large samples, there are some limits to the kind of insights we can generate with this kind of work. So to complement this kind of research, it's helpful to conduct qualitative work to explore family-related challenges and experiences within the framework of functional definitions of family as well. This can help understand some of the gaps that might otherwise not be detected if we were using solely restrictive ways of conceptualizing family. So that being said, there's still a tremendous value in population-based studies that use demographic and household information to operationalize family, such as the census. And in that regard, it's going to be incredibly interesting to see what comes out of work related to the inclusion of a veteran and military service identifier in the most recent census. I'm sure that'll provide a lot of interesting insights on the composition of CAF families going forward. So this concludes my presentation, but before I go, I'd like to acknowledge the many people who helped support this work. And I also would like to thank all of the defense team members who volunteered their time to complete the survey, despite the fact that they were facing what was likely a very scary and uncertain time. And last, if you want to read a little bit more on some of the topics that I covered in my presentation, here's a list of the references that can point you in some directions. And thank you very much for your attention. Once again, I'm very honored to have had the opportunity to deliver this keynote at this year's forum. And I really hope that you're each able to take something away from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. This was an informative presentation that I look forward to learning more about in the future. We appreciate your time and dedication. This brings the main plenary for the family session to a close. I would like to invite all of you to join Family Session A and Serving Military Session C, or switch between the two for the rest of today's oral presentations. Once again, a 5-minute buffer between the main plenary and the start of the next session has added. If you run into any technical difficulties, please don't refresh. You will enter the session shortly. Thank you all for participating, and I appreciate your patience.